Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring transhumanism and the technological singularity. My guest is Dr. Reza Jorjani, who is the author of Prometheus and Atlas, World State of Emergency, novel Folklore, Lovers of Sophia, and Iranian Leviathan. Welcome, Jason.
It's a pleasure to be with you again, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to have you back with me in Albuquerque. I'm delighted to see you. So transhumanism is a very technical subject. I mean, as far as I know, the people who are really into it are techies for the most part. I can just say, by way of introducing the topic, that occasionally I post announcements of our new Thinking Aloud videos to some of the transhumanist discussion groups, and I often get comments like they don't want to have anything to do with anything of a parapsychological nature. They think it's all woo-woo.
That's right, and it's very unfortunate because, as I hope to explore in the course of our discussion, the origins of transhumanism actually lie in alchemy, in the revival of alchemy during the Renaissance. And, the idea of transhumanism is inextricable from the concept of the technological singularity. And when you look at the coining of that term by John von Neumann in the 1950s, there's nothing explicitly materialist about the way in which von Neumann defines the technological singularity. He describes the singularity as he says that technology is developing at an ever advancing rate, leading up to, quote, some essential singularity, unquote, in the history of the race, as he puts it, past which human affairs as we know them cannot continue. And so there's nothing intrinsically mechanistic about this or overly reductive about this definition of the singularity. And it's worthy of note in that connection that among the proponents of the view that consciousness plays a fundamental role in manifesting physical phenomena among the first generation of quantum physicists, John von Neumann was one of the quantum physicists who took most seriously the integral role that consciousness plays at a fundamental level in the universe.
In the collapse of the wave function. In other words, two things. One, that consciousness is responsible for everything we experience in physics. Everything we can measure is measured by consciousness, but that consciousness, you can't get underneath it, so to speak. That consciousness is the bedrock of reality.
Yeah, Bohr, Heisenberg, and von Neumann and Erwin Schrödinger were among the people who took very seriously the role of consciousness in the manifestation of physical phenomena. And then there were others who were in favor of a more mechanistic, materialistically reductionist interpretation of quantum physics. But the fact that von Neumann was one of these advocates for, taking consciousness seriously in interpretation of quantum theory also underlines the non-materialistic notion of the singularity at the moment that he's coining the term in the 1950s.
We should also mention Max Planck and Eugene Wigner, along with von Neumann. But let's talk about the term singularity. It's a word I think many people have heard. I've heard it used in terms of the Big Bang, like that was a singularity.
Yeah, the idea is that it's a point past which you cannot extrapolate from the past into the future. It's a catastrophe in the classical sense that René Thom defined the term catastrophe. It's a vortex where models that are based on extrapolation forward from data about the past break down. Mm-hmm. So on a graph with, let's say, an exponential increase, it's the point where the graph spikes. Mm-hmm. And there's a something beyond that spike, phenomena continue. Presumably there'll be some form of society, but it's impossible to extrapolate in the same way as we have been from the past into the future, after that singularity has occurred.
Now, I have interviewed a guest, Nicole, her last name escapes me at the moment. Anyway, she came out of Singularity University. And that, I believe, was founded by Ray Kurzweil, I think. And it's a whole school of thought based on the idea that the singularity is going to occur in a very mechanical way. You could say that artificial intelligence will reach a point where the computers themselves are more complex than the human brain.
Right. I mean, and that's one pathway to the singularity. After von Neumann, I think one of the most significant definitions of the concept, the technological singularity, was in a paper by that name, which was written by Vernor Vinge, a science fiction author and technologist. It was a 1993 paper, I believe, called The Technological Singularity. And Vernor Vinge points out that strong AI is only one of 4 pathways to the technological singularity and to the transhuman condition that would follow from that. The other 3, so I mean, the strong AI vision, which is the one that that is championed by Kurzweil, is the idea that engineering a superhuman intelligence inside of a computer system will by itself lead to this singularity. And the AI will then manage our lives, more effectively than we could run human society. And we will effectively be assimilated into whatever form of life it determines for itself. But then there are 3 other pathways, as Vinge argues. And, one of them is that computer networks will become so sophisticated and human minds will be so enmeshed in cyberspace that the sheer networking of human intelligence will give rise to a kind of cognitive functioning that is not reducible to any one of the humans participating in the network. So while there's no centralized strong AI, the network as a whole develops a kind of a functional intelligence that is superhuman. And that leads to the technological singularity. Then another path is that cybernetic implants allow us to become transhuman, to break through into the next phase of our evolution. And the thing about cybernetic implants is that they're not wholly replacing the organic brain with all of its evolutionary history. So if it is in fact the case that the kinds of capacities studied by parapsychologists like telepathy and psychokinesis have some, as of yet, a kind of origin in the evolutionary history of man that has not yet been understood within the mechanistic and materialist paradigm that biologists are working with. The cybernetic implants can take us into a post-human condition where we still have access to those capacities. And in effect, the computer components within us that are enhancing our intelligence are parasitic on a whole evolutionary biological history. Rather than attempting to replace that simply by modeling a human mind in another medium like silicon or treating consciousness as if it's simply information processing. So it's another path. And if you think about these 2 so far that Vinge lays out in the technological singularity, the idea of a computer network involving humans developing its own intelligence, and the idea of cybernetic implants as a path to a transhuman condition, the 2 of these fused together is essentially the vision of the Borg in Star Trek: The Next Generation, of a cybernetic species with a hive mind. So that's one vision of the transhuman condition that doesn't require a centralized, strong AI. And then the last one Vinge suggests is that genetic engineering alone could increase human intelligence to a superhuman level, where the people who have had their IQ boosted through germline genetic engineering and other biotechnologies would begin to think and act in ways that we could never even conceive of. And whether that by itself represents the arrival of the technological singularity or not, at the very least, we could say that those genetically enhanced humans would bring about the singularity. Okay. And the idea again is that they would do so in ways that we can't extrapolate based on our study of human societies to date.
Now, I think you shared with me a term that's popular in the transhumanist community. I think, is it GRIN?
Yes. So that's genetics, robotics, information, and nanotechnology. And the idea is that the convergence of these advancing technologies will bring about a transhuman condition. So, for example, Hans Moravec has argued, he's a roboticist, he's argued that the approach that was taken for decades, all the way from the 1950s onward, when we had, these sci-fi visions of robots like in Forbidden Planet and even in the Jetsons and so on in popular culture, the approach that was taken by robotics of modeling a robot on a human being, of trying to replicate a human being in a mechanical form, was mistaken. And that's what led to the stagnation of robotics for so many decades. And the robotics revolution is going to take place by adopting two different approaches that ultimately converge. And one is a bottom-up approach of studying how insects function and building biomimetic robots that can navigate the environment as effectively as certain insects. And they can develop an evolutionary history of their own, learning how to successfully navigate obstacles and effectively interact with objects. And then you take this bottom-up approach and you fuse it with a top-down approach of developing more and more effective expert systems of working on artificial intelligence. And as Moravec puts it, you have to drive a spike through this top-down approach and the bottom-up approach to create really effective robots who may not look anything like human beings, but they'll be able to navigate the environment very effectively and have a high degree of intelligence and competence.
And that's what seems to be going on right now in the field of robotics.
Yes, this is. He wrote about this, I think, two decades ago or so, and he was anticipating the shift that's taken and advocating the shift that has in fact taken place in robotics right now, which is one revolutionary development leading to this technological singularity. Another is nanotechnology. And so when we talk about robotics, we have to remember that there are robotics that are, there are robots that are being developed on a molecular scale. And these could accomplish tremendous feats of surgery and so on and so forth. And they could be really effective in the medical profession. But they could also pose really catastrophic dangers to society. I mean, there's the infamous gray goo scenario where if you have nanobots that can rearrange material on a molecular level, if they were to get out of control and, if we were to see the equivalent of a computer virus inside programmable nanobots, they could begin to degenerate all of the material around them, basically attack everything in the environment. And so, one of the dangers of this technological singularity brought about by GRIN, by genetics, robotics, information, and nanotechnology, is that it forces us to develop a new model for how to organize society.
Well, earlier you pointed out that the whole concept of transhumanism has its origins in ancient alchemy. So let's go back to that and look at some of the historical precedents that may give us more of a context.
Right. Well, the Russian cosmists of the 19th century were mystics who can, I think, definitely be seen as precursors of transhumanism, as heralds of transhumanism. Nikolai Fyodorov, or Fedorov, to use the anglicized form of his name, was a Russian Orthodox thinker who was very into the scientific and technological advancements of his day. And he came up with a fascinating a theory about how humanity would colonize the entire cosmos and then be able to somehow re-engineer the people who had died in the past and populate this kingdom of God with the departed. So it's a kind of technologically mediated vision of the resurrection, where the human colonized cosmos is the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, and the resurrection is accomplished through technology.
The same idea has been advocated by the American physicist Frank Tipler.
Yeah, and Tipler, I think, was influenced by Teilhard de Chardin, his idea of the omega point. And, these Russian cosmists, because the roots of their thought were in Russian Orthodoxy, in Russian Orthodox mysticism, they were in large part marginalized, for the most part marginalized by the Soviet establishment. So they were driven into exile in Paris. And because there was always a connection between, the Russian aristocracy and the French. And so they chose to take up residence in Paris. And I think that, Teilhard de Chardin came under the influence of the Russian cosmist school of Fedorov in Paris. And so there is an indirect connection between Tipler and the anthropic cosmological principle, and the Russian cosmists. I said that for the most part, they were sidelined by the Soviet establishment, but there was one very important exception, and that was Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. And he actually was accepted by the Soviet establishment. He was made the head of the Soviet rocketry program. So Tsiolkovsky was basically the Russian equivalent, the Soviet equivalent of Jack Parsons. And
who founded the California Institute of Technology and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, was, I recall, a friend of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, and a student of Aleister Crowley.
Right. Well, the parallel, that I'm trying to make is that both of these men, the founder of the American rocket program and the founder of the Soviet rocket program, and the vision of sending cosmonauts out into space, both of these men were occultists, and had this very Promethean vision of using technology to affect the next evolutionary leap for humanity. So, for example, Tsiolkovsky, unlike Fedorov, he thought that basically Russian cosmism was paying lip service to Russian Orthodoxy, and that really the spirit of cosmism was Promethean. And so he took a much more active approach in the advocacy of technology to transform the human condition, to the extent, for example, of being a very prominent advocate of eugenics, and of the use of eugenics by the cosmonauts as they colonized the universe and left terrestrial humanity behind as a kind of husk. And it's interesting that, despite the Soviet opposition to eugenics, despite its being beyond the pale of official state ideology, he was seen as such a valuable rocket scientist that, effectively, he laid the groundwork for the Soviet space program.
Now, you mentioned this Promethean ideal, which brings up, of course, Mary Shelley in her novel Frankenstein as another precursor of transhumanism.
Yeah, and, Mary Shelley confesses that the parts of her novel that have to do with Dr. Frankenstein being under the influence of Renaissance and medieval alchemists were inspired by her overhearing her husband's discussions with various friends of his, like Lord Byron. Percy Shelley was steeped in alchemy. Percy Shelley was such a deep student of alchemy that some of the people who knew him in his tragically brief life believed that he was going to be the Isaac Newton of chemistry. He would do alchemy experiments in his dorm room in Oxford, his both poetry and prose writings are full of alchemical ideas. In particular, the idea of the alchemical androgen. Shelley did a translation of Plato's Symposium that's quite famous, and he believed this narrative in Plato's Symposium which was somewhat common to classical antiquity in general. This narrative that humanity had been androgynous in some primordial epoch, that the primordial form of man was not yet sexually differentiated, and that the sexual dichotomy was one of the signs of the fall of man from grace. And in order to regain Eden, in order to reverse the fall, we also had to reverse the sexual polarization of humanity and bring about the kind of alchemical androgyny. So, this is not unique to Shelley. You see this idea in other thinkers in the 19th century. So, for example, Edward Carpenter, the founder of the Iranian movement, also thought that heavenly man, Uranus, which later became the name of one of the planets, meant heaven in classical Greek. And so he thought that man in the heavenly state was androgynous and had undergone sexual differentiation as part of a transformation into the material condition. Kind of similar to Steiner's idea that, the early form of humanity wasn't entirely material and only in stages became increasingly material. Carpenter looked at this spike in cases of hermaphroditism that were being reported in the 19th century by medical doctors. And whereas a lot of the doctors in the 19th century were trying to classify, these hermaphrodites as having like a true sex, that these are men with deformities or women with that, they're biologically female, but they have certain deformities. Carpenter was saying that these cases of hermaphroditism were actually atavisms. They were, the manifestation of primordial morphological condition of humanity, and also heralds of the future reemergence of androgyny. And so I think that when you look at this kind of idea in the context of the emphasis on kind of a Promethean alchemical quest to transform humanity, you could also see a connection between transhumanism and transsexuality. Mm-hmm. And so there's that. And this idea is present in Frankenstein also, because the monster demands that a mate be created for him. And Dr. Frankenstein is obsessing over the fact that if he creates a female creature to be the companion of his first superhuman being, he will in effect propagate a race of devils upon the earth and usher in the end of humanity. So, this is one of the earliest visions of the technological singularity, of the extinction of man, and of, the rise of a post-human species on the earth.
This is fascinating, and I suppose it's also a bit reminiscent of the Jungian idea that the soul is androgynous.
Well, yes. That's the idea. And, when humanity was banished from Eden, it was for the sin of eating of the tree of knowledge. And the tree of knowledge is a symbol of science and technology. And the reason that we were banished from Eden is so that we would not also eat of the tree of life. This point is made very explicit by the Elohim in Genesis, that let's banish them from Eden so that they don't reach out and eat also of the tree of life and become like unto us, so that there's nothing we can do against them. Well, what this means is that the Elohim, the gods of Eden, are worried that humanity is going to attain immortality. And if you look at the depiction of the devas in Persian miniatures, for example, you'll see that they are hermaphroditic. They're neither male nor female; they're both. And so, if man was created in the image of God in Genesis, and Adam, the primordial Adam, was created before Eve was made from out of the rib of Adam, then as the Kabbalistic commentators, like for example in the Palestinian Talmud, the Kabbalists who wrote the Palestinian Talmud believed, the primordial Adam was androgynous. And so if the primordial Adam is made in the image of the Elohim and is androgynous, that means that the gods are also hermaphroditic.
Let me just ask a quick question. Palestinian Talmud, did you mean the Babylonian Talmud?
No, there's two Talmuds. There's the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud.
Okay.
And in the Palestinian Talmud, the Palestinian version of the Talmud, there's a gloss on the verses. I think it's Genesis 127, but I'm not 100% sure. There's a gloss on the passage about the creation of man, where they basically say, these rabbis basically say that, he was created male with corresponding female parts, he being the singular primordial Adam. And so if that being was created in the image of God, then the Elohim, then the Elohim are also hermaphroditic. And this is, again, what you see in the depiction of the devas in the Indo-Iranian tradition. It's in Persian miniatures, like, for example, the Shahnameh. I think that's another interesting aspect of this, transhumanist vision.
Well, you also indicated to me that there's a connection between ancient Persian Zarathustrian thought and the Russian cosmists.
Yeah, well, this is really fascinating to me that Fedorov, the founder of the Russian Cosmos School, was also one of the most prominent Iranologists in Russia. The Russians made major contributions to Iranian studies because, after all, the whole early history of Russia overlaps with that of Iran. The earliest cultures in the territory that's now Russia, the Scythians and the Sarmatians, were actually Iranian peoples. So the Iranian studies is very important to the Russians. And Fedorov was one of the early contributors to Iranian studies in Russia. And he thought that Zarathustra's worldview was the precursor of Russian cosmism as he was trying to expound it. And in particular, there are these several ideas that he found in Zarathustra as heralds of his own worldview. One is the progressive evolution of human society, the idea that instead of the cyclical time common to the Greeks and the ancient Hindus, that history unfolds teleologically through a successive stages, a successive set of progressively developing stages
towards a goal, towards an end point,
an apocalyptic end of history.
Yeah.
So this is another idea that not only is history teleological, but history is tending toward an apocalypse. And this apocalypse is going to radically transform the human condition. There's a vision of what's called the Freshgard, a kind of alchemical transformation of all of the beings on the earth who are, as it were, bathed in molten metal. So it's a very alchemical image, the image of the alchemical forge, transforming all of the beings on the earth so that they more perfectly instantiate the realm of forms, which is an idea that Plato got from Zoroastrianism, the realm of archetypes or perfect forms. And so at the apocalypse, the world would be transformed into a utopia that was a more perfect reflection of the archetypal realm. And then the last idea that Fedorov notes in Zoroastrianism as a precursor to Russian cosmism is that we should actively will this end of history. That Zarathustra, unlike many other religious thinkers, placed a great emphasis on the human will and humanity's integral role in cosmic history, that it's not all up to some omnipotent God, that humanity is tasked with adopting this progressive mentality, with choosing this evolutionary creative force and actively bringing about the end of history. And so I think these are all ideas that are precursors to transhumanism, or they're really the roots of transhumanism. And so it's not coincidental that the first thinker to coin the term transhumanism is an Iranian, Feridun Esfandiari, or Feridun M. Esfandiari, who later renamed himself FM 2030, was an Iranian who spent most of his life teaching at the New School for Social Research in New York. And he's the person who coined the term transhumanism. So, I doubt that, it's tangential that Zarathustra was the first transhumanist in history, according to Fedorov.
Esfandiari's book, Upwingers, was very influential back in the 1970s. I found it quite inspirational because he was suggesting that we can move beyond this left-wing, right-wing polarity and go up instead of to the left or to the right. I love that idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's a dangerous idea, though, because, Upwingers is subtitled A Futurist Manifesto. And so Esfandiari is explicitly connecting himself to the Italian futurists. Mm-hmm. And the Italian futurists are generally categorized as right-wing because F.T. Marinetti, the founder of Italian futurism, was a collaborator of Benito Mussolini in the 1920s. They were very close collaborators. Until later, they had a falling out. And the reason they had a falling out was because Mussolini increasingly came under the influence of conservative Catholics and other Italian conservatives. Whereas Marinetti was radically opposed to tradition. I mean, he actually advocated going into the Uffizi Museum in Florence with sledgehammers and smashing all of the Renaissance sculptures because he thought that they were chaining Italy to its past.
I see. Would have been a criminal thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But I think it's very important to point out that when you look at the vision of the world of tomorrow in the 1930s, when you look at the architectural drafts of Hugh Ferris, for example, in America, or even when you look at the neo-futurism in the period of FM 2030, in the period of Feridun Esfandiari, for example, the concept drawings of Sid Mead, who was a designer and then a futurist artist, both in the 1930s and then in the reemergence and persistence of futurism in the 1970s and in Esfandiari's time, when Esfandiari is coining the concept of transhumanism as a successor to futurism, there is a kind of aesthetic harmony in this vision of the future. There is a kind of internal cohesion and a grand synthetic vision for how cities would be designed, what interior design would look like, which presumes an organic society or, if not, then at least an authoritarian form of government that's able to fully plan society. Mm-hmm. And so there is a kind of right-wing dimension to futurism, going all the way back to Marinetti, but it's not traditionalist. In fact, it's anti-traditionalist. And so maybe, the ideological conflict that's more appropriate to characterize is not one between left and right, but one between traditionalism and futurism, which you see even in the milieu of fascism in the 1930s.
Now I can imagine like a Cartesian diagram where you have futurism at the top, traditionalism at the bottom, and also left and right going horizontally.
Yeah, it's much more complex than what people usually think. Like one of the prominent philosophers of the period of Marinetti in Germany was Ernst Junger, a philosopher, intellectual, whatever you want to call him. He had served in World War I and was very impressed with the power of mechanized warfare. Mm. And he thought of mechanization as what he called a forge of Vulcan that was going to reveal that we are not Homo sapiens as much as we are Homo faber, that our essence is to be Promethean creators and engineers. Mm-hmm. And so, you have, and he's considered a far right-wing thinker, even though he refused to join the Nazi party. Younger refused to join the Nazi, but he is considered a right-wing thinker, and yet, he's extremely progressive and visionary, like Marinetti, and very opposed to any kind of religious conservatism.
Now, we've used the term Promethean several times in our discussion, and I think for benefit of our viewers, it might be good to dig into that a little deeper. I consider you a Promethean thinker. Prometheus was the Titan in ancient Greek mythology who gave the gift of fire to humans and as a result was punished.
Yes, but more than that, Prometheus is the engineer of man. And so, Mary Shelley subtitled her work the modern Prometheus, Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus.
Yeah.
And so Prometheus is the creator of man. And Zeus actually punishes Prometheus not just for gifting fire to the gods, but the first punishment of Prometheus is for having created man at all.
And gifting fire to the humans, from the gods.
Yes, did I say? Yes, right. So Prometheus gifts fire to man only because after having engineered humanity to be a race of new gods, to in effect replace the Olympians, Zeus condemns mankind to slavery. And it's because Prometheus's creation is enslaved by Olympus that Prometheus, as a remedy, gifts humanity with fire, the fire of the forge, with the power of science and technology, with what the Greeks called techne, or craft. The wellspring of all the arts and crafts, all the arts and sciences. And so, the subtitle of Frankenstein is The Modern Prometheus, and you see this idea reiterated throughout the whole history of the Frankenstein archetype as it's evolved in popular culture. So, for example, the film Prometheus, Ridley Scott's 2012 film Prometheus, which is a prequel to Alien, is about this idea of the engineering of man by a rebel god who wants to defeat the existing divine order. In the Prometheus film, there's a man who's the head of a corporation, Wayland, has this corporation, and he has discovered that these extraterrestrials engineered humanity. And he sends an expedition into space with archaeologists and other scientists to go find the engineers of humanity, because he wants ultimately to attain immortality. It has a kind of a Gilgamesh dimension to it also, because he's a man in quest of immortality. But there's an android on board this ship, Prometheus, which is like the son of Wayland, because he's a being engineered by Wayland, like Dr. Frankenstein engineers the creature. But the irony is that as the story evolves, and as it's picked up in the sequel to this film, Alien Covenant, the android is the only one who survives the expedition. They find the engineers at the end of Prometheus. They find the engineers. But what they find is that the engineers, they find remnants of them, and also discover, to their horror, that these gods were planning to annihilate humanity. So there's the kind of Noah's flood element in this, that the gods, repented of their creation of man. They regretted that they made man, and they were going to wipe the earth clean with a biological weapon. And this biological weapon is the alien creature, from the 1979 Alien film. So ultimately, the android, David, in the sequel to Prometheus, Alien Covenant, he becomes the Dr. Frankenstein, ironically. He's the only one who survives the initial expedition. And he, to make a long story short, sets up a Frankenstein's laboratory on the planet of the engineers, where he carries out experiments over a long term on a female crew member. So she had initially survived together with him, but then he basically turns her into a guinea pig, and he carries out months of experiments on her, keeping her just barely alive. And the drawings that he does of these various genetic experiments that he's carrying out on her in order to engineer a superhuman form of life are in this exquisite Renaissance style, which I think is Ridley Scott referring back to Dr. Frankenstein, studying the alchemists of the Renaissance like Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus and so forth, and portraying David, the android, as a Dr. Frankenstein. So there's this idea, of Prometheus creating a race that is supposed to supersede the gods, but then, it supersedes the creator himself. It's the creation superseding the creator, which basically is just an expression of the life force constantly overcoming itself in new forms.
Well, many people associate, the Frankenstein legend with the idea that human technology is going to get out of control and become monstrous.
Very much so. And, if you look at the concept art for Alien and for the Prometheus films, it was done by H.R. Giger, Swiss-German artist, and it's absolutely horrific. It's a beautiful portrayal of the potential horrors of transhumanism, and also very clearly demonstrates the debt of transhumanism to alchemy. H.R. Giger's first book was titled The Necronomicon, in a conscious reference to H.P. Lovecraft. And the narrative of Lovecraft in At the Mountains of Madness is echoed in some ways by this expedition to the planet of the engineers in the Prometheus saga. The role that Antarctica plays as the wrecked cradle of the gods of the Cthulhu mythos in H.P. Lovecraft is the role that's taken up by the planet of the engineers. I mean, these become symbolically equivalent, and so Giger's art, I think, is also a very clear example of the alchemical origins and occult vision that's at the wellspring of the transhumanist movement, despite the overly reductive and materialist form that it's taken in people like Ray Kurzweil.
Mm-hmm. Well, what a fascinating discussion, Jason. We've covered an encyclopedia's worth of material, and I know we could delve into this so much deeper. It seems as if one of the many lessons I'm drawing from this conversation is that those viewers who may be interested in transhumanism would do well to consider its roots in such things as cosmism and alchemy and Zoroastrian theology.
Yes, and I think that especially given the dangers posed by the technological singularity, and the perils of navigating this transition into a transhuman condition, it's very important to remember the spiritual origins and the metaphysical dimension of this movement, and to fuse the kind of quest for superhuman capacities that you see, say, in Michael Murphy's Future of the Body, that you see in the Esalen movement, or that you see in people like Frederick Myers with his concept of preverts who are signaling the imaginal form of humanity while man remains in the larval state. It's important to not draw some artificial distinction between technological augmentation of humanity and a will toward the spiritual evolution of man into a post-human condition.
Jason Reza Jorjani, thank you so much for being with me. I'm delighted that you're here in Albuquerque. I'm looking forward to several more conversations with you, which I'm sure will be equally fascinating.
I'm looking forward to it as well. Thank you so much, Jeffrey.
And thank you for being with us.